Man, you guys are sounding good today. I tell you what, it is good to be with you, man. Yeah, give yourselves a hand, come on. It's amazing. I've missed you. It's been a couple weeks. I don't know where you guys have been. I don't know what's going on here. But it is so wonderful to be back with you. Honestly, just once again, so grateful to this church to be willing to give my family and I the month of July off to go and rest and refresh. And so to be back, it is just so good to see your faces, to be with you, and to be back. I feel like the family's all back together. The reunion is back. And we had an amazing month. We were able to take our entire family. One of my favorite places in the world is the Boundary Waters canoe area. Any fans? Anybody? No? You guys like comfort and beds? Oh, we got one. It's my father-in-law. But that is us up there. This is at the end of our trip. I love the dirty knees and the unshaven faces. And I also love the 9 million hot cups on the table over there. That's kind of a fun thing. The kids caught crawdads basically all day, every day. We even cooked a few of them, boiled some. My kids ate crayfish for the very first time. You can talk to them, but that's probably going to be the one and only, one and done type of deal. If you've ever had crayfish before from northern Minnesota, it's not like the South. But my wife, she tested her hand at fly fishing and just had quiet mornings, hammocks on the water, watching the sunrise and sunset, just incredibly peaceful moments. I love the Boundary Waters because the cell phones don't work. Praises all around. We also were able to get away, just Callie and I, my wife and I, just be able to get away for just the two of us. And we went to Mackinac Island, and this is us on a tandem bicycle. And if you've ever ridden a tandem bicycle, you know that that is not great. And it will reveal all of your control issues that you may have. When we rented the tandem bicycle, the guy that was renting it said, "Well, congratulations, I guess you're going to rent the divorce horse." And I was like, what does that mean? And literally 2 seconds in, I'm like, paddle, paddle, paddle. What are you doing back there? Paddle. It was crazy. We are still married, still love each other, but it'll test your marriage. That's what I'll say. Just if you want to test it a little bit, figure out where your control issues are, tandem bicycling is for you. But it was an amazing week away to be able to just spend time reconnecting. But really, I really missed being here and just excited to be able to jump in to this message series that you guys have been in for a week. And so week 2 is what we're jumping in with 167, and Dan kind of alluded to it, but it's a little bit of a strange message title. If you've been around church for a while, it's like, okay, 167, that's kind of a strange and odd thing to talk about. It's referencing that there are 7 days in a week, 24 hours in a day. If you do the math, it adds up to 168 hours in each and every week, which means you and I have 168 hours to steward however we want, to use in however we see fit. And so as followers of Jesus, we generally spend one of those hours here in this building as the corporate, large, Big C church gathering together for corporate worship to kind of rally the troops, to kind of have this reunion, have this moment where we're reminded of the goodness of God and that we're all in this together and that we belong. And then we walk out and we walk back into our lives, back into our neighborhoods and our jobs and all of those things. And we have 167 hours left to figure out what we're supposed to do with. And so we're looking through a single chapter in the Bible. Romans chapter 12 is what we're going to be in for the entire month of August. And so if you have a Bible, I would encourage you to bring that along with you. But this 167 is really the idea of more than just like the 167 and 160 hours, but what do your 167 currently look like is question kind of number one. What are you currently spending the majority of your time doing outside of the walls of this building? And then in response to that, what should they be looking like? What are some things that we could be doing with that 167 hours that maybe we aren't, that maybe God is calling us to do? And so looking at chapter 12 inside of Romans, it's all about Jesus at the front end. So chapter 12 is where we kind of find this divide in the book of Romans. And so these first 11 chapters, they started off there and it was like Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. This is who he is. He's the Son of God. He's the Messiah. He offers peace and hope. And he came to forgive the sins of all people. And he's talking about how all people can be grafted into the body of Christ. Whether you are Jew or Gentile, no matter where you are, slave or free, man or woman, no matter what you are, you have an opportunity to come into a relationship with a holy and loving God. And so Paul, the author of Romans, he spends the initial 11 chapters saying, this is who Jesus is. And then in chapter 12, he does a pivot and he says, rather than looking over here at who Jesus is, he says in chapter 12, in light of all of that, what does this mean for followers of Jesus? What does that mean for you and for me? What does it mean for us to live out our life? I truly believe that if Paul was here today, he'd be saying, what does it look like for us in light of who Jesus is to live the 168 hours of our lives in response to his goodness? And so that's where we find ourselves looking throughout the chapter 12 and this huge shift from who Jesus is to who we are in response of that. Paul is writing to a church in Rome, and this church is divided. It is a divided church. They are trying to figure out who is in and who is out. Sound familiar? Yep, the world that we're living in. If there's any word that I could use to describe the world that we're living in, politically, socially, spiritually, we are living in a divided world where everybody is trying to figure out who is in and who is out. Who are the people who are on the inside and who are the people who are on the outside? And so Paul is writing to this church in Rome with a similar message to say that if we spend our 167 hours outside of the time when we're worshiping together, if we spend our time doing those things that God has called us to, that it will create unity amongst the believers. And if there's unity amongst the believers, it just might be true across the entire world. And so that's what we're looking at. That's where we're jumping in with chapter 12, is what does your 167 hours look like? Last week we set up the foundation of it, looked at the first two verses, and we're going to jump in to the third verse today. And so Romans chapter 12, verse 3 is where we're going to be at. You can page into that inside of your Bible. But this is what it says. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed each of you. This verse is talking about humility. It's talking about not thinking about yourself more highly than you ought to. Instead, think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith that God has distributed to each and every one of you. In accordance to the faith that you have in Jesus, that is what you are responsible for. Do not think more highly of yourself than you ought to is speaking to this word humility. And when you hear the word humility, there might be a couple of things that come to your mind. I think humility is kind of a confusing word in our culture. Like, what does it look like and what does it actually mean to be humble in our world? And I think there's a couple of things that really we struggle with. The first is that many of us believe that humility is self-deprecating. That humility means we put ourselves down. That means that I need to be lower and less if I'm going to be humble. But humility is not about putting yourself down. It's not about being self-deprecating. That is not one of those things. When I was growing up, most of my childhood and most of my young adult life, I spent believing that if I were to accept a compliment, if I were to acknowledge that there was a gifting, an affinity, something that I was uniquely gifted to do, if I was going to even acknowledge that that was true of me, that that was arrogant. That actually was the opposite of humility, that it was actually prideful. And yet what we find in this verse is that we just must not think more highly of ourselves than we ought to. Not that we must think low of ourselves, because that's doubting who God is. God has crafted and gifted you for special things. Humility is not self-deprecating. It's not thinking less of ourselves. Humility is thinking accurately about ourselves. Thinking accurately about who we are, accurately about our gifts, accurately about our talents. Humility is all about accuracy. It's accurately acknowledging your strengths and your weaknesses and allowing the balance to live inside of you. And this matters because we can't have any meaningful impact on anyone else if we're not honest with ourselves. If we're not honest with who we are, our gifts and our talents and our drawbacks and weaknesses, if we're not honest with ourselves, we can't have a meaningful impact on other people. You see, humility is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. It's not thinking less of yourself, putting yourself down. It's just thinking of yourself less. It's not all about me. It's actually there might be something else going on in the world. Maybe God wants to bring us all together for a greater purpose beyond just what we want to do in this very moment. And Paul's words are incredibly practical. Very clear as he finishes up talking about the man of Jesus and the life of Jesus and how as followers of Jesus, we must now put this into place. He gets really, really practical. And he just begins to share thing after thing after thing. If we live this out, if we live out humility, if we put them into our 167 hours, when we're out in the world, when we're out in our workplace, when we're with our families, when we're in our neighborhoods, it would completely change everything about us in the best way possible. Humility is not thinking less of yourself. It's thinking of yourself less. The second thing I think is a misunderstanding about humility is that humility is comparison. That humility has to do with how I measure up with everybody else. Well, I don't make that much money, so I must be humble. Well, I don't do that as much as that person, so I'm more humble. Humility has nothing to do with comparison with your fellow man. Comparison is no place inside of humility. Humility is only found when we are looking at the man of Jesus. When we are seeing ourselves in the reflection of a holy and powerful God, that is where humility lies. It is not in comparison to other people. And yet we do it constantly, don't we? Everything we do is kind of, how do I measure up? Where am I at in this friends group? Where am I at in the hierarchy at work? Kind of what are the dynamics of the world that I'm living in? Like, what do I look like compared to these people and these people and these people? And we compare ourselves all over the place. And as a result, we're either proud and we're arrogant and we're puffed up because we think we're higher than somebody, or the opposite, we think we don't have anything to offer. We think that we're terrible. We think we're garbage. We think that we suck. We think that we don't have anything to give this world, and neither of those things are humility. Humility lies in the balance of effectively and accurately knowing your gifts and your talents and your drawbacks and weaknesses. And in that intersection, at that place where we have an honest evaluation of ourselves, that is where humility lies in light of who God is. No matter where we find ourselves today, when we listen to the words of Paul, we can't do it if we're comparing ourselves and being self-deprecating. Do not think more highly of yourself than you ought to, but instead view yourself with sober judgment. We don't find it in other people. Where do we find it? We find it in the man of Jesus. We find it in the life of Jesus. Yes, we're looking at Romans chapter 12 in this moment, and yet what we find in chapter 12 is broader than just chapter 12, verse 3. What we find is that this is a common thread that we find throughout the life of Jesus that ties the narrative of Jesus and God on the planet and his relationship with you and me throughout the entire narrative of the Bible. And as we look at verse 3, yes, it is so clearly articulated, but this is not a one-off. This is not an anomaly. This idea of being humble and not thinking of ourselves more highly than we ought to is a common thread that we see inside of the life of Jesus throughout his life and throughout the biblical narrative. In light of everything we know about Jesus, in light of everything said about him in the previous 11 chapters, in light of all of the things written inside of the Gospels, all of the things of Jesus, in light of all of that, we contrast ourselves to him and it drives us to humility. Not when we compare ourselves to other people. Don't think more highly of yourself than you ought to. Throughout our week, as we live out our 167 hours outside of this building, I think so oftentimes, specifically in the American church, we believe that our relationship with Jesus dwells within the walls of this building, and nothing could be further from the truth. The body of Christ is on the move as soon as this service gets out. I believe that is when the church actually begins. Church begins when we walk out the back doors of this building. The 167 hours, the clock begins when we leave here and we go back out into the world, back to our jobs, back to our families, back to our neighborhoods. And in that moment, what Paul is reminding us of is that is where the life of following Jesus begins. This is a bubble. And if you look at the life of Jesus, you don't find him in the synagogues and the temples all the time. He's walking down the roads, and he's spending time with people, and he's healing the sick, and he's rowing boats, and he's out fishing, and he's out doing all kinds of things. Jesus lived the 167 the way that we're supposed to. And when we live out our 167 in that same way, it changes everything. Church, it will change everything in the best way possible. It changes us. It changes the way that we talk to other people. It changes the way we interact with other people. It changes our attitude, our language. It changes everything about us. It changes the way we see others. It changes the way we see ourselves. This idea of having an accurate understanding of who you are, it will change your 167. Because in light of God, we begin to see ourselves with sober judgment. It's a strange phrasing, isn't it? Sober judgment. Like I read it, and I'm like, oh, do we really want to use that language? So I read a bunch of different translations. And sober judgment in other translations, it translates over to honest evaluation. Sober judgment means honest evaluation. To have an honest evaluation of who you are in light of who God is. Let me just take a quick time out here. We look at the life of Jesus, right? If you know anything about him, Son of God, right? Miracle worker, walked on water, like healed the blind, did all this amazing stuff. Son of God, creator of the world, perfect life, lived without sin, lived the life that you and I did, faced all temptation and yet did not sin. If there was anybody that has ever walked on the planet who could be arrogant and prideful, it would be him, right? I mean, like, I don't know if you've ever seen anybody walk on water. I haven't. I think it'd be crazy and cool. Or I don't know if you've ever walked around and healed sight to the blind people. I don't know if you were the creator of the universe. I don't know any of those kinds of things. But we're not, right? Jesus could have been arrogant and prideful, and yet from start to finish, the life of Jesus exudes humility. He didn't come riding into the world on a white horse as a political leader to conquer the world. He came as a baby. Is there anything more humble and simple than a baby? He entered this world in the same way that you and I did, humbly and quietly and softly, into a family who would raise him and care for him. His leadership, when he could have just been beating people over the head and arrogantly saying, would you just listen to me? I'm the Son of God. I know what I'm talking about. Instead, what did he do? He served. He chose humility as his leadership structure. The way that he lived and led was bathed in humility. And then he ends his life on the planet in the most humble way possible for you and for me as a living sacrifice for us. He paid the price that you and I never could for the sins that we all caused, past, present, and future, and he went and he died with death, even death on a cross, with humility, with you and I in mind. And so I just want to say that out loud to say if there's anybody who could be arrogant, it should be him. And yet what he's saying is that humility is always the right choice. And he's calling you and I to do the same. That in light of his example, in light of the life that he lived, in the way that he experienced the world, to live with humility. And friends, when we live our life with humility, you know what it does? It slows down our speech. We begin to be quick to listen and slow to speak. It causes our fuse to lengthen. We're no longer angry and flying off the handle. We find ourselves humble before our own children, humble before our spouses, humble before our coworkers, humble before other people, where we understand that we don't have everything going on, but actually that our lives aren't all that perfect either, because at best, you and I are a work in progress. At the very best, you and I are a work in progress. We have to be reminded that all good things come from God. Every breath that we do, every gift that we have, every ability that we have, it all comes from God. Even the breath in our lungs, if we are reminded of that, we can't help but be humbled in that moment, can we? In light of the perfect example of Jesus, that where we live our lives, where we spend our time, the way that we express ourselves, the gifts that we've been given, they all come from him. And when it comes from him and he lived his life humble, we can't help but do the same. I would argue that we can only be humble when our eyes are on Jesus. Humility only happens when we're looking at the man of Christ. I have looked around social media, I've looked at the news, I've looked at my neighbors, I've looked at other people, and I've tried to find humility there, and I just can't, because it's not supposed to dwell there. It only dwells when our eyes are on Jesus, because he's the one who humbles us. Do not think of yourself more highly than you ought to, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, an honest evaluation. Try to have an accurate picture, an honest evaluation of who you really are. The term that we use today is self-awareness. How many of you have heard that? Show of hands. How many of you have heard the phrase self-awareness? Most of us have. It's kind of the new way of saying this. It's an easy way to say humility. To not think more highly of yourselves than you ought to is being self-aware. This is who I am. I'm not this person, and and I don't have these things, and I'm not this and this and this. This is just me. I'm just me. I just put my pants on one leg at a time. I put this shirt on because I like it today. You put that shirt on because you like it. Some of you might need to look in the mirror a couple more times. I'm just kidding. Maybe I needed to look in the mirror one more time. I don't know. But this idea of self-awareness, it's a sneaky and crazy thing. There was a survey done recently where they polled a large group of people and they put them through a bunch of questions to ask them, are you self-aware? 95% of the people surveyed said, I'm self-aware. Immediately following that survey, they put them through an inventory that tested their self-awareness, and 10% passed. Let me just let that sink in for a minute. If you think that there's a reason for the divide in our country, it just might be that we are completely unself-aware. That we have a ton of people, 85%, in case you didn't do the math, 85% of our population is walking around this world thinking, I've got it figured out, I know me, I'm self-aware, and when you figure it out, you don't, only 10% do. You are walking around thinking that you understand what it's like to be around you, when really only 10% of us do. How many of you think you're in the 10%? Yeah, didn't see many hands on that one. But I truly believe that inside of all of us, there's a part of us that we believe that we're really self-aware, that we are humble, that we do have an honest evaluation. And I'm not saying that it's any malicious intent or intentional thing that we're doing. I just think some of us are walking around without the understanding that we're completely unaware, that we don't have an honest evaluation of who we are. Have you ever been in a room with somebody who's completely unself-aware? You should all... I see some poking happening right now. No poking and pointing at other people. But we all know it when we see it, don't we? We all know when there's somebody who walks into the room and you're like, oh, here comes Bob. He doesn't have any clue what's going on. Oh, I'm about to hear about how amazing he is. We all know that coworker, right? Who lacks that self-awareness, that neighbor who over time, all of a sudden you see him coming, and you're like, I didn't need water that bad. Opposite direction of the water cooler. You look out your front window, maybe I should go mow my yard. Oh, not today. We all have that person where we know that we try to avoid them because they're completely unself-aware. That friend in your friends group where it's just like they've been a part of the group for so long and it's like they were a part of this thing. Maybe it was like back in college or they were a part of this and that. And then all of a sudden they've kind of become really, really unself-aware. And all of a sudden it's just kind of like starting to separate. Now they don't get invited anymore. And they feel like they're kind of on the outside and they're not really like in the inside and included. You know that person, don't you? Or maybe it's that parent who lacks self-awareness and has children that grow up and hold them at arm's length. That have adult children that are trying to keep them at a distance because they're unself-aware. The problem with people who are not self-aware is that you can't take them serious about anything. It's the boy who cried wolf. They continue to inflate and inflate and inflate and puff up and puff up and puff up. And at some point, it's just like, none of this is true, and I can't be around it, and I don't trust you, and I don't want to be around you. We can't trust them about anything. And the reason that this verse is so important, to not think of yourselves more highly than you ought to, but to think about yourselves with sober judgment, with an honest evaluation, is because as followers of Jesus, being humble, having an honest evaluation of ourselves, having self-awareness is how we're able to have meaningful relationships. And when we can have meaningful relationships, we have the opportunity to share Jesus in those relationships. It's not about just having deep relationships. It's about the calling that we've been given, that in light of Jesus and what he has done for you and for me, that we have a high calling to say that we have been called to share the good news of Jesus everywhere we go, with everyone we meet. And if we can't have meaningful relationships, if everyone's holding us at arm's length and saying like, oh, I don't want to mow my grass today because I might run into Jim, I don't want to do that, we have lost the opportunity to share the good news of the gospel of Jesus with people all around us. It's heavy, isn't it? The interesting thing about this is that I would guess that many of our stories are traced back to a person who had self-awareness enough to love us enough, to care for us enough, to eventually show us who Jesus was. And we find ourselves as followers of Jesus because someone did the work to not think more highly of themselves than they ought to. And the same should be true of you and me. And I don't stand here today to say I've got it figured out. I'm a fellow sinner, a fellow stumbler towards Jesus. I love people and I love Jesus, and I want to be more and more like him each and every day. And I believe that if we can figure this out, if we can apply this to our 167, that it could change the world. So how do we grow in this area? All right, all that's great. Now what do I do? I mean, it matters so much that as friends and as parents and as leaders, these verses Paul is telling us that as followers of Jesus, think about yourselves with sober judgment, with an honest evaluation. What's a step that I can take? If I can take another time out in this moment, I just want to say that this is the moment where the rubber meets the road, where the gospel grows legs. When we get practical and we say, okay, I understand, and I've heard this, and I know this, now what do I do? This is where the gospel takes off and walks out the back door of the building. Because getting practical is that moment where we understand I need it to be practical, because if I just know about self-awareness, but I don't live it out, it doesn't help anybody meet Jesus. We actually have to take this and apply it to our lives and understand that being humble, that having an honest evaluation of our gifts and talents and letting that live out in our 167 is the only way that the gospel goes out from this place. If we don't actually do any of the things that we learn, our life won't look any more like Jesus. It'll just continue on and on and on. And I don't tell you this because I'm an expert at following Jesus. I've already said it. I'm a fellow sinner and a fellow stumbler towards Jesus. And I just want to get better. I want to be better tomorrow than I was today. God isn't asking us, Jesus isn't asking us for perfection. He's asking us just to take the next step. To get practical and apply the things that we learn from the Bible is so incredibly important. So how can we have an honest evaluation of ourselves? How can we become more self-aware? You've got to ask. I know that's pretty sophisticated and profound. You have to ask. You have to ask somebody, what is it like? What's the experience like when I'm around? You ever ask that? That's probably not a normal over the counter, over the coffee, over dinner question. What's the experience like when I'm around? What's it like to be on the receiving end of a conversation with me? What's it like to be on the receiving end of my life? What's it like to sit around a table with me, to be at my house, to be with my family, to work with me? What's the experience like when I'm around? It's a simple question, and yet it's incredibly difficult to answer. Because remember, we have an 85% difference between people that believe that they're self-aware and people that actually are. 85% of us aren't getting this right, so there is an experience that's happening with people around us that is not what we perceive it to be. The facade that we're putting out there is not what we believe it to be in our minds. Only 10% of us, 1 out of 10 of us in this room and online, are actually experiencing self-awareness. Like, what's the experience like when I'm around? What's it like when I'm in the room? What are people seeing and hearing and experiencing and feeling when I'm around? When people are around me, what are they feeling? What are people seeing and hearing? Like, what's their perception of me? Like, my presence alone, like, what am I communicating? Do I bring joy to the room? Do I bring excitement? Do I bring dread? Do I bring negativity or positivity? Do I suck all the life out of the room? Do I bring life to the room? Am I the person that never commits to anything? And it's always like, I'll definitely maybe try to be there. Ever got that friend? Doesn't commit. Or maybe you're the person, am I the person that talks and talks and talks and talks and talks and never shuts up? Or am I the person that kind of stands in the corner and people kind of talk to me and I just stand there like a bump on a log, a super weirdo, like awkward? What is the experience like when I'm around? To get more specific, what's it like for my kids to be around me? What's it like for my spouse or my coworkers or my neighbors to be around me? If you're from the Midwest, you're probably thinking, oof, right now. I know I am. If we figure out the answer to this question, what's the experience like around me, church, it's going to change the way we live our lives. It's going to change the 167 hours we live outside of this building. It's going to change our lives in the best way possible. It might feel like a lot, but it's worth it. What's the experience like when I'm around? What's it like to be on the receiving end of me? For those of you and I who follow Jesus, when other people are around us, when people interact with us, people will come to understand what it's like to experience Jesus as well. And that's why it matters. It matters because when people interact with us, they can see Jesus and experience him through us and through our lives and through our 167 hours that we spend with them. Humility and self-awareness. Get these two things and put them into our lives. Live them out in your 167. Live them out here too, but also live them out in your workspaces. Cultivate them. Invite God into your 167 each and every morning, and God will begin to move and change all that we are and all that we have. And so my challenge, we're going to get even more practical, is I want to challenge each and every one of you, myself included. I am committed to doing this week, and I want to say sometime in the next 167 hours, I want you to ask one person the question that I've just posed. What is the experience like when I'm around? You're probably going to give a little bit more meat on the bone than that. Don't just invite somebody out for coffee and the very first thing out of your mouth is so what's the experience like when I'm around? Won't work. What's it like to be on the receiving end of a conversation, to be around me? What is it like to be in the room with me? Two caveats to that. Don't ask your best friend. They're no good to you in this moment. Don't ask anybody who's a people pleaser. Don't ask the person who works for you. If their livelihood is connected to you being happy with them, they will lie to you. This is no help if people lie to you. Find that person. If you're honestly thinking in your head, who should I ask? Who should I ask? And you're like, I don't want to ask that person. That's them. That's the person. Ask that person who will be brutally honest with you. Because church, we're just trying to get better. We're trying to figure out and have an honest evaluation of who we are and how we operate. Second caveat is do not defend yourself after they answer. Don't do it. Everything inside of you is going to be like, well, that's not what I meant. I'm not like that. I don't do that. Everything will want to rationalize it away. And what I want you to do is don't try to defend yourself. 3 years ago, I was challenged with this question, and I went around and I asked 3 people, what's it like to experience me? What's it like to be on the receiving end of me? And I will just tell you from my experience, the very first thing that you'll want to say after they start telling you things is to defend it. I know, I've been there, I've done it. Again, 85% of us don't understand how we actually are coming across to other people. Don't defend yourself. Don't rationalize it. I would encourage you, bring a notepad. Write the things down. It's so much easier to not defend yourself and run it back if you're writing notes. It will honor them and tell them that you actually care about what they're saying. Ask that question to at least one person this coming week. I am committed to doing it. And I want to encourage you to do the very same. If we do this, it will not only change our 167, but it will change somebody else's 167 as well. Because when we humble ourselves, when we have an honest evaluation of who we are, we can, 1, find ourselves in deep, meaningful relationships with people. And when we have that, we have the opportunity to share the love of Jesus with them. And church, that's what we've been called to. We've been called to be in meaningful relationship with others so that we can earn the right to share the love of Jesus that we found with them. And so ask one person, what's the experience like when I'm around? Amen? Let's pray. God, I I just pray that you would just instill this inside of us. God, this isn't a once and done thing. This is a process and a progression that we have. And so, God, we surrender in this moment to you. God, we surrender the uncomfortableness. We say that we know that there's something valuable in being self-aware and knowing ourselves better because we have the opportunity to know and love people, which will in turn show them your love and your care and offer them the salvation that we found. And so, God, I pray that you would light a fire in this place, that during this hour, each and every week, that there would be a revival going on inside of your people, and that revival would grow legs and walk out the back door of this building, and it will go to the ends of the earth, God. This matters so much because this is your business plan for sharing your hope and your gift of salvation with the planet. You have decided to use us, and so, God, just allow us to move forward, to have boldness, to ask the question and to implement the things we hear, to be more self-aware, to not think of ourselves more highly than we ought to, so that we would earn the right to share the love of your Son, Jesus, and the gift of salvation with them at some point in their life. God, give us boldness and light a fire inside of us. We love you and we praise you and we are trusting you for this and for so much more. And all God's people said, amen.
Amen. We're going to be singing one last song here, so if you're able,